Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Andrew Schwartz at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. We're joined by Tarun Chhabra, who just stepped down in the critical role of Senior Director, Deputy Assistant National Security Advisor, and Coordinator for Technology on the National Security Council staff in the White House, really the conning tower for strategies to prevail in the strategic competition with China over the most advanced technologies. Tarun, we've had plenty of chances to meet over the years. I've always learned something. Thanks, and really looking forward to it.
Likewise, Mike. Thanks so much for having me on.
Let's start with you because people like to know how they can also become Tarun Chhabra. I am guessing when you were a kid, you did not think someday I want to be the White House Senior Coordinator for Technology. So give us a quick path how you got into international security, your interest in Asia, and all the rest.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So it's great to be on. I was really inspired by some faculty members. I had faculty advisors, and as an undergraduate at Stanford, people like Steve Stedman, who became an undergraduate advisor, Chip Blacker, who had actually served on the National Security Council staff, focused on Russia and Ukraine at the time, Liz Sherwood-Randall, who I ended up getting to work with as a Homeland Security advisor during the last administration, and others, and knew I wanted to do some of what they did and working in national security. But then from there, I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. My parents are immigrants. I had no idea what the path would be, how you get to work in roles like that or get to work on stuff like that. So I actually ended up at CSIS as an intern before my senior year of college, working for Steve Morrison in the Africa program. And he was a really gracious mentor. He actually brought in the National Intelligence Officer for Africa at the time to hear out my summer project. It was actually about China's influence in Africa. And then from there, I spent a year in Russia on a Fulbright scholarship at the Moscow State Institution for International Relations, which is kind of the breeding ground for their foreign service. And then from there, I actually started a PhD program in security studies and decided it was not for me, and left that, went back to work for my undergrad advisor. So I was glad to have maintained that relationship with them. He was working at the United Nations in New York at a time for a panel that Kofi Annan had organized, looking at rules on the use of force and Security Council reform. And it was really in that kind of first job that I kind of figured out I wanted to better understand law and legal policy as it would intersect with international security. And so I decided to apply for a scholarship, fortunate enough to get it. I studied international relations in Oxford and then went to law school after that. And then I became a speechwriter. That was kind of serendipitous. I was lucky enough to work on a couple speeches when I worked at the UN for Kofi Annan. So I had a small portfolio, a little bit of writing I could share. And there was an opening working for Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. So I ended up going essentially from the UN to the Defense Department, not your usual path, with some grad school in between. And then I got to work for Secretary Carter as well, which was a really terrific experience. And then from there, I had my first stint on the NSC. That's about.
That was in the Obama administration, that first stint?
That's right. Yeah, I was there for almost the last 2 years of the Obama administration.
And then Georgetown CSAT, you were at Brookings too, I think, if I remember correctly?
I was at Brookings, first working with Bruce Jones and Tom Wright there in their strategy program. And then from there, I ended up going to Georgetown, to the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. It was totally fortuitous at the time. Jason Matheny, who was a former director of IARPA, was setting up a new center to focus on U.S. China technology competition with an emphasis on artificial intelligence. I was fortunate enough to get a role there. And a lot of that, of course, was during COVID, but we were set up actually really well to work virtually, and then started working with a lot of really sharp young analysts there who ended up coming in to work in the administration as well.
The lessons in that background are rich for people looking at their careers in this field. And I know after the 2024 election, this happened in 2016 when I was teaching at Georgetown, some people said, will there be a field in international relations? There sure will. A lot of it will be technology. And what you did is check a lot of the key boxes, internships in the right place, the right mentors. You can be from Shreveport, Louisiana. You don't have to be born in Washington, D.C. like I was. And what you describe is an exploration. It was a reconnaissance. You were trying different things, seeing what you were good at. I have a lot of students who think at age 22, they have to decide what they're going to be when they're 50. And you don't, as you showed. You need to be good at your job and intellectually curious, get the right mentors. So, and technology competition is not a field where when you were in school, people were being trained. I'm a little older than you. And in the 90s, there was a rich literature around national innovation systems and Schumpeterian destructive capitalism and the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, all inspired by Japan in the 80s. And the Japan guy, I studied all that stuff, kind of went away. And then over the last 5-6 years, all of this theory, policy, CSET at Georgetown was at the forefront, just exploded. So there's another lesson in that as well, which is what you may study today may just not be as relevant in 10 or 20 years.
Or it may come back around.
Exactly. And I think technology, exactly. This is a very nostalgic, familiar topic for me. I did my dissertation in the 90s on Japan's post-war aerospace industry and technology competition. Some very similar debates, very, very different problem set with China. So it's come up quite dramatically. You know why, but explain to people what's at stake in this competition with China, especially for the frontier technologies like semiconductors, quantum AI. What's at stake? What does it mean if the U.S. loses? What does it mean if we quote unquote win?
Well, I obviously have a point of view, Mike, but I kind of think it's everything. That's why it's so important. I mean, if you think just about artificial intelligence and the potential applications it's going to have, I think it has the potential to be truly transformative across many dimensions of national security, across our economic security. It's hard to even fathom the ways in which it could transform both national security and our economics in many ways. And so it's not just about winning and being ahead. It's also about having the time to kind of think about the whole domestic suite of policies that are going to be needed to take advantage of these technologies and mitigate the risks as well. But that's just AI. I mean, then, one of the areas I got to work on as well as biotechnology, biomanufacturing. While the sector is kind of in a bit of a dip now, the potential and the promise is really still there. And it's all the more important, I think, that we have kind of an industrial policy ensuring we don't lose some of the critical R&D in that space or the opportunity to scale some of the technologies there. Again, opportunity to really fill gaps in our supply chain, to build more resilience in the supply chain, and to give us many more options kind of beyond traditionally petrochemically based products. And that's important for DoD. That's why we had a program dedicated to enabling DoD to procure and cultivate firms in that area. We're in this moment where there are so many sectors that are either exploding now like AI or potentially on the cusp of doing it, and quantum could be another. And it's just absolutely critical that we get all dimensions of this right. It's not only protecting the technologies, although that's absolutely critical, but it's also on the investment side, and not just government money, grants and loans, but it's really what is the right policy environment to ensure that the investments are scaled and deployed at a commercial level as well. So it's in so many ways not just a problem for the national security bureaucracy, it's one for domestic policy and our national economic agencies as well.
In surveys of Fortune 500 CEOs and boards, researchers are finding that when they ask what are the top things vexing your company and clouding your planning, geopolitics and AI are always at the top. Let me just rewind the clock to the late 80s, early 90s. As we were having this debate about Japan, there was what was a famous episode. Clyde Prestowitz wrote about it in his book, Trading Places, where in the Reagan administration, when somebody at USTR was pushing for more restrictions on technology, trade, and tech transfer with Japan, somebody from the Treasury Department said, why do we care whether we make in the United States computer chips or potato chips? And a little while after that, the Wall Street Journal, I think, had an editorial where they actually went through the biotech and other things in potato chips and said, these DRAMs are commodities. Potato chips are now actually quite high tech. The government should not be making these choices. And I think for the most part, in that iteration of the debate with Japan, we returned to what scholars call a national open innovation, not a national innovation system, benefiting from global innovation for the most part with Japan. Why with China is that not really going to work?
Well, I think, we have a track record that we have to reckon with, which is for a long time, as you pointed out, we didn't come to grips with China's industrial strategy. So if you look at what happened in telecom, if you look at what happened with solar technologies, battery technologies, the record is pretty clear. Without some sort of national strategy, and look, we could debate which components to emphasize, which components to not. It's not worked out well for us, and it's not worked out well for like-minded countries either. And the ones who have been able to survive and weather China's industrial strategy better are the ones that have had national industrial strategies themselves, like Korea, for example. I think the record is clear. And so from that perspective, we came in saying semiconductors are so foundational, not only to the coming AI revolution, but also for so much of our high-tech manufacturing and that of our allies as well. We can't let it happen there as well. And we have to try to make up for lost ground when it comes to clean energy technologies like batteries, solar, and so on. And that's where you got both the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as then a suite of measures that we took to try to protect our own technologies, whether we're talking about restrictions on outbound investment or some of the export controls. I do think it is interesting to look at the very different political valence, between bipartisan support we had for chips, whereas that was not the case for the IRA. And obviously that's up for debate right now with the new administration and Republican Congress. And one thing I do worry about is that sometimes it's too tied, I think, to questions about climate. I think we should be able to say, even for those folks who don't think climate change is real, we should still ensure that we have full spectrum energy dominance in the United States. And that means investing in the energy technologies of the future and not being dependent ourselves or enabling our friends around the world to become dependent on Chinese dominance in those technologies. And that's a conversation I think we haven't had with that kind of really clear strategic competition lens.
Yeah, I think for the administration you worked for, the climate hook was politically critical. It's not now, not for this administration. So the underlying, strategic rationale you just described is going to come to the fore. It's interesting. I did surveys when I was at CSIS, public opinion surveys, 2020, and then in 23, 24, here at the U.S. Study Center in Australia, we surveyed the American public and the Japanese and Australian and Western European in some surveys. And when we asked, do you support reducing dependence on Chinese technology, you get a consistent answer with across all these advanced economies, 2/3 of the public saying, yes, we need to reduce our dependence on it. So I think the broad public support is behind this. They don't support in these polls complete decoupling. They want to sell soybeans and cars and stuff. But there's a pretty solid, and I would venture bipartisan basis, not just in the US, of course, but the publics in Japan and Australia and the Netherlands. And one of the most fascinating parts about watching you do this job is it is sort of classic Thucydidean or Metternich grand strategy, because you had to form alliances for this policy because the US does not have the dominant share in semiconductor production technology. We need Japan, we need the Netherlands, Korea. Say a little bit about how you approached allies and partners. That is not what it was like in the 90s when the US had a much more dominant position. You couldn't affect these controls without convincing, aligning allies and partners. And I think successfully did for the most part. But tell us about it. Who mattered? How did you approach it?
That was really one of the most fun parts of the job, was working with our close friends. And partly because whereas in other sectors, I would say sometimes the debates, the alliance management dynamics were different, maybe more fractious. But on technology, I think in high technology in particular, I think there was often a pretty strong shared understanding of the stakes. And that made it a lot easier. And the other arrow in my quiver was, of course, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan's strong conviction about the importance of strategic technology competition and of bringing our allies along. We had an interesting debate at the beginning of the term, and actually going back to the transition of what is the best way to kind of operationalize our approach to technology alliances. And on, one camp was get 10 or 12 countries in the room and talk about all the issues at once. And a lot of people wrote about that thoughtfully. That was a kind of T10 or the T12 construct that you're familiar with, I'm sure. Another approach, which is the one that we ended up taking, is one that Jake has called variable geometry, or there are other ways to describe it. But essentially, it really boils down to working with the partners that have the most skin in the game for particular technologies, right? And so you alluded to a couple, in the world of semiconductor tooling, between the United States and Japan and the Netherlands, right? We do have real dominance in that area. And so if the three countries can agree on things, that takes us really a very, very long way. That changes over time. You got to be able to adjust. And you saw some of that toward the end of the administration with other countries also taking similar measures. But that was a key piece. If you're looking at, semiconductor production itself, obviously Taiwan, Korea, Japan are crucial. And so we had really critical cooperation happening there. More broadly, there was a way in which we could leverage the high interest, not just at a leadership level, not just among strategists, but also the general public in technology, high technology, to deepen general strategic cooperation. I'd say India falls, squarely in that category, with the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology that was led, by Jake and his counterpart, Ajit Doval, but was embraced by both leaders as well. And then it was also an important dimension of the Quad, as you know. We had a group in the Quad focused on critical technologies. And it was also another really a pillar, I'd say, of the trilateral with Korea and Japan, where both countries have now made big investments under the banner, as you know very well, of economic security and organized their bureaucracies, both in the line ministries, but also in the prime ministerial and presidential offices, really to focus on economic security.
And while the U.S. didn't have the dominant share in, say, for example, semiconductor tooling, there was a stick. I mean, most of what you did was carrots. It was diplomacy, it was alliance building, it was consultations. But is it fair to say that in the background there was a stick, even with close allies, the Foreign Direct Product Rule, the Entities List, and other export control tools that were wielded, I think, surgically, but hypothetically could have been quite blunt instruments that would have affected the interests of these countries and their companies in the U.S.? How much did the stick matter, do you think, in the background?
Yeah, and I think it mattered not only in the sense of, that it was always hanging out there. That's one dimension, of course, but it also mattered because our allies have options in terms of how they want to work with us. One way is we come up with the framework and then every country goes out and rolls out its own regulation that is largely conforming to what has been agreed. That's the one way of doing it. Another way is to say, actually, you, the United States, why don't you roll out the regulation? You can use your foreign direct product rule and we will comply with it. It'll take us a year otherwise, or it'll be complicated politically for us to go through with our own legislation. And we also worry a little bit, some might say, about what the retaliation dynamics might be. And so actually, we just prefer, why don't you go ahead and write the reg and we'll follow through and comply. And so from our perspective, we want to be pragmatic. We want to see the impact from kind of collective action on this front. We were not looking for countries to kind of invite a needless retaliation. And so it actually gave us some nice options that accommodated differing outlooks about how they wanted to deal with China.
So it was a convenience to be able to blame the US of A for some of the controls.
We were happy to take it.
Happy to be bad cop. My sense, we discussed this, is a lot of these governments, and we're only talking a handful, Japan, Netherlands, Korea, they were very divided on what to do. They knew that they were exposing themselves to enormous vulnerabilities by continuing the intense cooperation with Chinese firms on this advanced technology. They knew that, but they were also very, very worried about retaliation and also worried about profits. And you've heard this a million times, I'm sure, but the revenue from sales to China for some of these advanced companies equals their R&D budget. So I think what the approach the administration took was tip the scale on the internal debates so that it made sense to move in the direction you were suggesting. But I'm curious if you can tell us how much of a debate was there about collateral damage to American R&D and innovation? Because for some of these big firms, including in the US, the China market was helping to fuel their R&D budget. That must have been a tough call. How did you approach it?
It's actually precisely why we have a structure that consists of 4 agencies that have export control authorities: defense, energy, state, and commerce. And it's why commerce is in there, because commerce is in the lead in interfacing with industry. And that is the perspective that you're going to expect them to bring to the table in, any administration, Republican or Democratic, and you see that in Republican Democratic administration. So it is kind of by design. And of course, the same industry players that could be impacted are going to be talking to each of the agencies, and they're going to come to the White House as well to kind of make their case. The challenge is, over time, we've seen really an intensification of this trend where, you have really non-market behavior in China. So, at the beginning of our administration, we would hear, well, you're not going to see real stockpiling of semiconductor tooling. That's not the way this works. Every tool is, customized for every particular place in the fab and so on. By the end of it, it was very clear that was just not a plausible argument. There was an enormous amount of stockpiling going on and tooling being warehoused, sometimes anticipating controls and sometimes just really as a function of the enormous amount of almost limitless resources coming directed from the top to build out China's semiconductor industry. And so at some point, you do have to make a national security call, and that's where it is the role of the NSC to bring the agencies together and, as necessary, elevate to kind of make that call. But to be fair to a lot of our industry actors, their most important consideration was, usually not losing necessarily just the gross revenue. It was, what is the relative position vis-a-vis their similarly situated competitors? Their concern being, will a foreign competitor be in a privileged position because the controls on them are not as stringent, and therefore will they come in and eat up my market share? That's a really important thing that we had to think about and consider and work through with allies constantly. And that's just going to be, it's embedded as a key factor in export controls decisions. But the flip side of that is sometimes America has to lead first. Sometimes we have to take the first step, the stronger step, and then work with allies to follow suit. And that can be hard for industry, particularly in that gap period, before you have the leveling up with allies.
And it takes not one flight to Tokyo or The Hague and a brilliant PowerPoint presentation, as you've found and successfully demonstrated. It takes persistent diplomatic engagement, not for the meek. It's a lot of travel.
It's also working on the bigger picture of what our alliance is about with our friends, right? It can never be just about this one thing. I mean, I remember even during the Afghanistan evacuation, fielding calls from my Dutch counterparts because I'd worked with them so closely on a number of things as they were trying to get some of their folks out. You just have to make clear that the United States is in these alliances for the long game and across the many dimensions of our allied interests.
That is a really important point at this moment in history. You can't just have these transactional asks or adjustments of allies in isolation. You got to look at the larger message you're sending about alliances. And you were, I think, probably lucky to have Kurt and Mira Rapp-Hooper and people like that.
Yeah, fully backing that vision of what our alliances are about, particularly in Asia.
So, famous Eisenhower line, even the best plan is only good till first contact with the enemy. The other guy gets a vote. Just ask the Kansas City Chiefs. China's moving too and taking its strategy on the chessboard. A lot of people are saying that DeepSeek revelations are demonstrations that this strategy isn't working. Obviously, Beijing is finding workarounds for some of these technology controls. What's your thinking about the next iteration of this approach? Where are adjustments necessary for the U.S. and for our allies?
Well, a few points on that. So the first is adjustments are absolutely going to be necessary. We were trying to be clear that we would need at least annual updates to kind of keep track of technology developments in AI, in the semiconductor field. That just goes without saying. And we did that, starting from 22 onward. The second thing I'd say is we were following DeepSeek for probably 2 years, well before it kind of splashed into the front pages of U.S. and Western media, knowing and believing that they had some of the most talented AI research scientists in China. I was lucky enough to have an incredibly talented staff, including Teddy Collins, who's fluent in Mandarin and spent 8 years as a research scientist at DeepMind in London, and so could read DeepSeek's papers in Mandarin and followed them very closely as well. So, but the key point is, look at what the founder of DeepSeek has said consistently. He has one problem, which is access to AI hardware. And so if you look at what DeepSeek did, we were coming essentially, kind of to the end of an 18 to 24 month cycle of model releases. And we've consistently said that is about what the US lead is. So it shouldn't be surprising that as you get to the end of that cycle, and we're now on the cusp of new releases coming from leading US companies, you're going to see highly competitive Chinese models, at least at the high end. But the Washington Post has done some really good reporting on this. The foundation model that DeepSeek developed, that trained and then kind of levered up with the new test time compute paradigm was a large batch of A100s, NVIDIA A100s that they stockpiled in 2021 prior to the 2022 export controls. And so our view has always been that the impact of the export controls will compound over time. There is a large compute base in China, and they're using that, of course, to kind of do as much as they can, getting as close as possible to the AI frontier. But most people in the field still believe that AI scaling laws are going to continue, and it's very hard to scale circumvention at that level. And over time, we may see a phenomenon that further compounds this dynamic, which is people beginning to use their own models for programming to advance their own AI. And so you could see potentially, not only a lead coming from scaling, but also a lead coming from having more advanced AI to train your AI as well. So this game is far from over. I really worry that there was a lot of PRC amplification of this narrative in our media. We had actually advisedly Jake Sullivan say in September of last year that there's an active PRC information operation trying to promote the narrative that export controls are futile. This certainly helped to play into that. And I think you'll see more kind of forensics coming out in open source research about the amplification here. And of course, Li Qiang was visiting DeepSeek just the week before the amplification took place, and it was very much part of the Lunar New Year kickoff as well. So important, I think, to take that into consideration too.
It's a game about technology and also narratives, isn't it? Last quick question. It's early days for the Trump administration. It's obviously dizzying with the flood the zone, shock and awe, break things, move fast approach. My sense was when you came into the White House, at least the instincts or the recognition of the problem was pronounced for the outgoing Trump administration. Their approach was a bit different, but they understood a lot of what you were saying. And now that we have Trump 2.0 and some of the same people are coming back, do you think there's going to be some continuity? And if so, where? I know it's early, but what are you expecting?
Well, look, we definitely, I think, shared by and large a diagnosis of the problem. I think we also inherited from the Trump team some really important and powerful tools, such as the commerce ICTS authorities that we use to essentially ban Chinese connected vehicles. Just to give you one example, you could say some of the export controls built on the tools that the Trump administration used vis-a-vis Huawei specifically. And I could give you other examples as well. And then when you tried to expand the toolkit further, I can't speak for the new team. I think it's pretty clear that there is a broad spectrum of views on some of these issues in the new administration. But I do think that there is certainly a contingent of folks that sees the same problem, is going to pick up on some of the tools that they developed and that we built on, and that probably will also use some of the new tools that we developed as well. But what I can't tell you is how it all shakes out in the broader China strategy policy overall, right? How does this fit into the broader China trade policy and what might happen on tariffs? What's going to be put on the table and so on, and what's going to be maintained as we push things through. One key question for the new administration is what to do with a few things we did in the final, week of the administration, just to name a few. One was significant new regulation focused on AI diffusion, kind of how we want to see American AI, diffused around the world while also trying to minimize the risk that chips and compute kind of get into the hands of the PRC in particular. A lot of controversy around that, and it's up to the new team to take comments and finalize that regulation, and that has global implications. The second is we pushed out some regulations on very advanced biotechnology equipment, out of concern that bioconvergence, the combination of advanced artificial intelligence and synthetic biology, could really enable significant new biosecurity risks, and we need to keep much closer track of high throughput advanced biotechnology equipment. And then on the AI infrastructure side, what we need to do to kind of build out at home we kind of really put forth, I think, a pretty robust vision of how we can use federal land, try to break through some of the bottlenecks on power and permitting to ensure that we are building out the largest AI infrastructure here at home as well. Hopefully that's something they'll add to and build on further, but it's hard to predict exactly how that's going to pan out.
Yeah, there are some things they're going to have to sort out. You're not going to build the coalition you need to control technology exports when you're slapping 25% steel and aluminum tariffs on the same countries you're asking for help. So there's going to be some sparks and they'll have to sort it out. And as you just pointed out, there's a pretty big agenda they're going to have to continue addressing. This has been terrific. This is the new great game, and you've been hard at it for the whole of the administration and deserve a little bit of downtime, but looking forward to more opportunities for people to hear your ideas on this, because this is a problem that is not going away. The game is on. Thanks a million, Tarun. Really, really great having you.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. Really appreciate it.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.